Joe Richardson, Joe Speak Podcast. Hello. Today we've got a good one. We've got former police chief Jim Bueermann, who is also the former president of the National Police Foundation. If you ever wanted the playing field on policing, on the things that are going on, and how to take them, and talking about a path forward, Jim Bueermann is going to be your guy. I thought it was very important, very timely to interview him now because he is a nationally recognized expert on policing. So we're going to talk about, can't wait, we're going to talk about Minneapolis. We're going to talk about defunding police, what it means, what it doesn't mean, the example that a lot of people have looked at in Camden, New Jersey. So he's going to tell some stories, give some policy ideas, and give you a really good primer on where we are and how to possibly articulate it in your own community, what you want to see from your police department. So glad to have Jim Bueermann here today. Joe Speak Podcast, Joe Richardson. Let's go. We are rolling and getting going here. It's Joe Speak, Joe Richardson, at the Joe Speak Podcast. And I am thrilled to have Chief Jim Bueermann with us today. I got to meet Jim because I'm lucky enough to live in the same town, Redlands, California, where he was the chief for many years, the chief of police. But he's also a nationally known expert on policing. And so I thought that, and most recently retired from being the president of the Police Foundation, which became the National Police Foundation. He'll give you a little bit of his background, but this is a interesting time to have a discussion about policing with folks that know and folks that have dealt with it their entire career. So, Chief, I thank you for being here. Why don't we start off by, give the benefit of a little bit of background for folks that don't know who you are and kind of how you got to being where you are and who you are in policing.
Sure. Well, first of all, Joe, thanks for letting me join you.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's a
My
real
pleasure.
honor, and thanks for doing this.
Yeah.
So I started in policing in the late 70s. When I was a young kid, I was captured by the police riding my motorcycle down the street illegally right after my mom told me not to do it. And
Right.
that whole process taught me I was impressed, even if I was 12 or 13 at the time.
Right.
I was so impressed with the way the officer handled this and he held me accountable. But I think more importantly, it kept my mom from killing me because she was so mad at me. And
that's always good.
Oh yeah, it was very nice. And I later worked with this guy, so it was a lot of fun to remind him about this. But it struck me as here was a public servant that was doing his job, and at that young age, I appreciated him doing it the right way. He was very compassionate about both my mom's position and mine, and he managed to be a peacemaker with that. So fast forward to the late 70s, I'm old enough now to do this, and started my career and spent 33 years with the Redlands Police Department. The last 13, I was the chief of police and the director of housing, recreation, and senior services.
Right.
Because we had a very unique policing model that was designed to control crime really before it occurred. So it was a preventative model. So we did a lot of things that were non-traditional policing activities, but we felt fulfilled our mission that was unique in this unique town called Redlands. And it just made sense for us. So I retired in the summer of 2011, went to work for the Department of Justice for a year, and then took the job as the president of what is now the National Police Foundation in Washington, D.C. And the foundation is the country's oldest non-membership, non-partisan police research organization whose mission is to advance policing through innovation and science. So we the foundation does a lot of policing research. And because it doesn't have members, its role in the world is less complicated in many ways because there's no members to drive the research agenda or give you their pointed opinion when they don't like the research results, which happens a lot in policing. So
right.
And then I retired from there the last day of 2018, and now I've been consulting and do consulting for a variety of entities.
Right. Fantastic. So this is an interesting time, to say the least, to have everybody seems to have an opinion about policing, right? And without invalidating the opinions of anyone, there's also the matter of folks that have been dealing with it, not only just looking through the window, but actually dealing with it from a day-to-day basis. So let's talk a little bit about the times that we're in now, and to the extent to which that really creates an honest opportunity to look at and improve the state of policing, and then what that means. Where's your starting place with that?
Well, we do live in some very, very interesting times, and they're tragic times and interesting times, and I think in some kind of odd way, optimistic times, because
Right.
I do believe we will be a better country when we get through all of the things we're going through, the pandemic and its social and fiscal implications, in addition, obviously the obvious health implications, and then with the social unrest around policing, has made for one of the most unique periods of American history, probably, that
Sure.
certainly we have seen up to this point. And if we get it right this time, then anybody will have ever seen.
Right.
The question is whether we will get it right.
Right.
Because we have been here before. It's not like
Sure.
We have never had a controversial police shooting.
Right.
We've had a lot of them, and we've had a lot of discussion and debate about how we should reform policing, how we should rethink policing. Is a little different twist to, I think, some of the public discourse now.
Sure.
One of the interesting things I think about this discussion is that in many ways, almost everybody is correct about their thinking. I'm of course not talking about extremists who think that the police should be out there just to knock heads, or on the other side of that equation, people who think we should disband all policing. I don't think
Right.
the latter one makes any sense, and the former one is just has no place, certainly in our society, but I think any place on the planet. But in that middle space where most of us are,
Right.
regardless of our perspectives, I think we're all correct in many ways about how we think about policing.
Sure.
Policing is about trying to keep communities safe, but
Right.
while the police are doing that, sometimes they're making it very unsafe in many ways for
Right.
people. And even if it's not as unsafe as some people may think it is, the perception of a lack of safety is there. And in
Right.
my former world of being a police chief, there is an adage that the public's perception is your reality.
That's right.
So usually that was used in the context of crime rates and people thinking that there was a lot of crime when there really wasn't.
Right.
Or at least from a police perspective, there was a lot of minor quality of life kind of crime, but not serious, what are called Part 1 crimes like murder and robbery, rape. But it didn't matter, because it is the perception that the public has that is what is important, and that carries the day. And I think right now, this is true also for police reform. Not only do we have empirical evidence about the need to reform police,
Right.
in terms of the numbers of people that are killed every year by the police in this country, we have lots and lots and lots of video evidence. The advent of smartphones,
Right.
social media, and the internet means that literally everybody is almost a citizen journalist. Everybody has a smartphone with video. So
Sure.
there's a lot more video today, video evidence of bad police behavior.
Right.
And so you've got both empirical kind of visual evidence that brings together, and anecdotal evidence, and brings together this public perception that policing needs to change. And I think that that's true. What I think is not really understood very well by most people is that qualitatively, policing has really gotten better over the years. When I
Right.
think about what policing was like in the 70s when I started and what it's like today,
Right.
there's almost no difference
Mm,
in terms of most of the day-to-day interactions.
sure.
The police hiring is better. They're healthier. Cops are healthier. They're more highly educated generally. The
Right.
training is better. The training is longer.
Right.
But in spite of all of that, we continue to have this high number of police killings. We continue to have incidents like we've seen. And so it is clear to me that while we have been advancing policing, we're still not working on the right pieces of it. And proof of that is the fact that we continue to have these kinds of problems. And we continue to have, I think, for us, an exorbitant number of people who are killed every year by the police. And within that number, the African American community suffers a higher rate of police killings than anybody else.
Right. Let's talk about the right pieces in terms of, what we seem to be missing. And then, the hot button issue, right, that everyone is terming is, hey, defund, right? And being a little, admittedly, middle of the road myself as it pertains to certain things, I was certainly concerned about the optics of the word. And I thought it was interesting that you had a perspective in terms of, well, here's what it means, here's what it doesn't, and we've actually been here before. So let's talk about the right pieces and how it connects to some of the things that people are asking about or demanding, and what that really looks like in the real world.
So when we think about policing, at least the way I think about it, I think there's several buckets that you kind of have to address in terms of policing. So the least controversial in many ways is the business of policing.
Right.
Police departments are a business. You are running a very unique business, but there are business things like budgets and HR concerns, keeping the fleet running, that are not sexy. Nobody really likes to talk about them, but you spend a considerable amount of your time in a police department just keeping the train on the tracks, right? Just trying to make sure that it is running. And we need to, because the cost of policing, especially here in California, continues to accelerate, and consumes more and more of the public taxpayers' dollars in municipal government, which is also part of this defunding piece.
Yeah.
We've got to get more efficient and effective on the business side of that. And
Right. Sure.
I won't spend much time talking about that, but I think that policing needs to look to the private sector and think long and hard about what is our bottom line, both as good stewards of the taxpayer investment in public safety, but also in terms of public safety, right? So that's our bottom line. If we were a company, we would be concerned about profit. We're not. Policing is not that kind of a business. And its bottom line really is the trust and confidence of the community and its ability to affect safety, public safety, whatever that means. So you've got the business of policing, then you've got crime control. That police are the only entity really charged directly with investigating serious crime and apprehending serious offenders.
Right.
There's been mission creep in that. We'll talk about that in a second when we talk about defunding. But there's nobody else when there's an armed robbery, a bank robbery, a rape, burglary, whatever. There's nobody else to call. When you call 911, you don't get a voicemail that gives you options. You
Right.
get the police, and the police come out, and that's what they're supposed to do. And I think most people don't have an objection with that, but there are ways of doing that more effectively. There's a movement in policing called evidence-based policing that we were at the foundation heavily involved in, and is near and dear to me. And that is just simply the idea that you use the best available scientific evidence to drive your policing strategies. And this is where policing strategies like problem-oriented policing or hotspots policing come from.
Right.
It's also where we determine that things like zero tolerance programs don't work. DARE in its earliest iterations did not work.
Right.
Boot camps don't work. Dissuade young people. So not only does it tell us what is effective in terms of controlling crime, but it also tells us what doesn't work and we shouldn't do it. And I think that's important because my own personal belief is that policing needs to adopt its own version of the Hippocratic Oath, or at least what that oath purports to tell physicians, which is while you're treating the patient, above all, do no harm. And
Right.
I think that policing needs to wrap its head around that while you are trying to protect the community, don't harm it.
Right.
And that gets complicated, and it gets even more complicated when you don't listen to the people that you're paid to protect. And that's, I think, part of how we've gotten where we are in this country. There's other attributes of that. The most, and then there's the personnel, the human side of police agency that needs to improve. One of the most important things I thought I did as a police chief was hire police officers. And by that, I mean, am I hiring the right people? Am I giving the right people the badge and the gun that to protect the people of Redlands? Because if you get the right people in the business, then you reduce the problems you have downstream. If you get the wrong people in the business, you have problems usually their entire career, and the problems can spread. Bad employees in a police department can be a bit cancerous, and they can infect other people. And if they're charismatic personalities, then it gets even more complicated and more challenging. So I think we need to do a much better job in identifying and measuring and screening for the core competencies that we need in whatever community. I think there's a global uniform set of core competencies, but every community is different. And so every community is going to have a slightly different approach and emphasis on some of those core competencies. But a respect for human dignity, I think, is universal. I think liking people is universal. I had more than a few conversations with police officers when I was disciplining them, and I thought that they didn't treat people well. I said, did we trick you somehow into thinking that you did not have to deal with people? Or when you got in the business, did you just miss the fact that it's entirely a people business and that you have to work with them because you don't appear to like people? So why are you in this business, right? So I think there is just some of these universal things. But then the question becomes, how do you measure for those? And then perhaps really importantly, equally as importantly, I should say, is how do you continue to monitor whether officers, through the trajectory of their career, continue to manifest those core competencies? So you may hire somebody who's the right person at the front end of their career, but police work can induce a form of PTSD or trauma on cops that changes them over time. And so somebody who may be a really good police officer at the beginning of their career, somewhere downstream becomes not a good cop anymore. And so the question is, can you rehabilitate them, or do you have to excise them from the department? There's a movement within policing called officer safety and wellness, and the wellness piece is kind of what I'm talking about here. The incidents of police suicide in this country are problematic. More officers kill themselves in the United States every year than are actually killed in the line of duty. So that is a problem. It's very similar to what happens in the military. And a few years ago, the military acknowledged that and took steps to try to help those people in distress. And I think policing is kind of at the cusp of that. So you have that. And then lastly, and I think for many people, this is what's currently in the forefront of the news, and what I think concerns most people is this bucket of concepts and ideas and strategies and realities that are framed around the public's trust and confidence in the police. And how the police, in my department, we used to constantly talk about this as investing in the bank of community trust, knowing that you're going to make a withdrawal at some point.
Absolutely.
And I thought that was very powerful. And to this day, there are still people in the PD that talk about that. Because in the very nature of police work means that cops are going to have to make split-second decisions. They're human beings. Sometimes they make the wrong decisions. or sometimes they make the right decision, but it doesn't work out well because when I was a kid playing football, the offensive playbook had a bunch of plays in it, and every play on paper scores a touchdown. And
Right.
the challenge with that is that there are 11 other players on the other side of the ball called the defense who have a different opinion about whether you should score a touchdown.
Right.
And in the world of policing, you think something is going to go well. So you're talking to somebody, and all of a sudden the interaction just really goes right off the rails. And that can happen for so many different reasons. Somebody is wanted and you don't know it. I have one of my first training officers was shot in the head here in Redlands when he was talking to a guy that he thought was stealing gas, and it wasn't any big deal until the guy started to walk away. So we walked up to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and the guy reached over his shoulder and shot him in the face with a handgun. Fortunately, he survived and we captured the guy. But I mean, that's how fast, and this happened in like 20 seconds. The whole interaction was only about maybe 30 seconds from the time he started talking to him to the time it ended. Same thing happens sometimes when police officers are talking to people with a mental illness, or they're trying to resolve a domestic violence incident, and all of a sudden somebody just kind of goes crazy and starts attacking the officer or whatever, and that happens. And we've seen this happen time and time again, officers are human beings, they have emotions, they don't always control them well. Somebody says something, does something, and it punches their button, and next thing you know, the cop is out of control and wailing on the guy and exerting a inappropriate, unethical, and completely illegal use of force on people. So policing is, by its very nature, sometimes, and you're working in an unstable environment because you're working in society. And how we try to explain policing to people, how we try to listen to people so we can change what we think we're doing in policing, or now this more, I think, radical approach, but I think radical thinking is what we need now, of people call it defunding. I think that's a problematic term.
Right. I do too, actually.
But reinvesting either money that we've saved from policing because we're doing it better, smarter, or we don't have, policing doesn't have to do certain things, and taking that money and plowing it into programs that are focused on homelessness, drug abuse, or mental illness make a lot of sense, because if you can remove the police from those situations, then they can't get out of hand because the cops aren't even there. Right. And that sounds really simple in many ways. However, there are times where people are not going to be available to handle that. Let's say we create a whole new division within the city, whatever city you're talking about, that responds to homelessness, mental illness, and drug addiction. There are going to be times when they're not available. And the only people that are really 24/7 social service providers in many ways are the police. The police didn't really volunteer for these things. I think one of the ironic and kind of heartbreaking realities for me is when I'm watching have been watching some of these protests, where at the point of contact, the police are upset and the protesters are clearly outraged. If you could stop everybody for a second and say, excuse me, but who here thinks that police should not be involved as first responders to mental illness, homelessness, and drug addiction? Both sides would raise their hand.
Even
Every
the
cop
police.
I know believes that somebody else should do this job. The problem is, the state government in California, for instance, a long time ago abdicated their responsibility for this when we defunded mental institutions and put a bunch of people that really need help at a place or other kinds of help. They washed their hands of it, and that left people on the street, and cities didn't know what to do. So the cops got the job, and the police have kind of a bias for action, and they usually salute smartly and carry on, and that's what they did. And the problem is we now have found ourselves in these other places. The other component of that is, I think, that the police end up involved in these situations where the state legislature has, in whatever state, has decided that low-grade crimes and low, really minor violations should be handled in a certain way. You should go to jail, you should have bail, you should blah, 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 when in fact, most of these things can be handled in a very different way. And in many cases, you don't have to arrest anybody. You're, giving them a ticket, and they're going to have to be held accountable, but it's not in a system where they're incarcerated, where they then lose their job or can't take care of their kids, or in the process of affecting that arrest, somebody dies. And we have seen this happen repeatedly in the United States, and we've had protests as a result of those things. So I think these are the kind of buckets of things that we need to work on. And I think there's lots and lots of police reform legislation being talked about. A lot of it is necessary. A lot of it has already been done. People have been talking about some of this stuff in policing and outside of policing for a very long time. So much of this is not new. I think Congress is stepping in with this policing act that has started to move its way through the House of Representatives, is a great first step, because it is aimed at trying to create a national coherence around policing. And right now we have 50 different policing models based on what the states are telling the police to do, because remember, Congress generally cannot tell local police what to do. And then even within the states, you have different models. So we have, to some degree, 18,000 different models of policing, which just does not make a lot of sense for anybody. So harnessing new thinking, harnessing existing things like de-escalation training or implicit bias training, and advancing them qualitatively or in quantity makes a lot of sense to me. But I don't think we should assume on any level that this is going to stop the most incendiary aspect of policing, and that is when the police kill somebody, especially under very questionable circumstances. So I think we need new thinking, and there are ways for us, I think, to address that. But in order for that to happen, our national leaders have to decide that the one singular goal that we are going to accomplish by the end of the decade is the end of police killing, period.
Right. Huge. Let me ask you this. I'm going to go back to go forward, because I know you've got some interesting perspective on defund, and being a police officer and a police chief for many years, and being a national authority and knowing folks, some of the personalities and the folks and the backstory involved in Camden, New Jersey, which a lot of people talk about. But let me ask you about where they did what some people would call a defund. But let me ask you about this first, and then I want to get to that, because you mentioned something about, for lack of a better term, rolling people up from a career standpoint for a very minor offense. Right. Does this connect at all? I have a theory, and you need to let me know if I'm right or whatever else. My theory is that perhaps some of this is what keeps police departments less diverse. A black man that had a marijuana conviction, years ago, or whatever else, or someone in that category that had something that's minor, and you have to have a clean record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is that one of the things that has affected diversity, the ability of police to have quality people on the front end?
I think it certainly contributes to that. So our system of justice has this idea in it that really is, in many ways, just false. That if you do something wrong, you're convicted, and you pay your debt to society, you're free and clear, right? You're done. You're square. I screwed up. I did some jail time, but my debt to society has been paid. And that's just not true. Mm-hmm. Criminal convictions, especially felonies, are the gifts that keep on giving. Right. They never stop. And, I think that all of us have made mistakes in our lives. I'm not the same person I was when I was 12 years old. Right. I'm not the same person I was when I was 25 years old. Right. And when we lose as a people, as a society, the capacity for forgiveness on a whole variety of levels, then we're not a better people, right? When you do that in policing, and you have changing norms, marijuana, for instance, is very clear. That when I first started in many agencies, if you had smoked marijuana, at all, that was a disqualifying factor.
Sure.
Then it evolved to, if you smoked it within the last 5 years, you got disqualified, and so forth and so on. And that just didn't make any sense when you think about the kind of things we all do when we're adolescents and all of that. So I think that this gets back to the hiring of people, right? For many years, and maybe we still are in a lot of departments, we're using the wrong measuring stick to decide whether a particular person should or shouldn't be part of the department. When you're a police chief, one of the decisions you have to make is how committed you are to trying to make your department look like the community you serve. And I don't know anybody in policing or in criminal justice research who doesn't think that that is important. Part of legitimacy in our world for the police is that your workforce has to look like both gender-wise and racially like the community it serves. And when it doesn't, it is easier for people to believe you're an occupational force. The best recruiting tools that I had when I was at the department were not the HR department's flyers, brochures, our website. It was community members that I had gone out to and said, many of them were in the faith community, said, I need you to help me get the right people on the job. And you know a lot more people than I do. And together we all know a whole lot of people. And some of those people want to be police officers or they're willing to consider it. One of my concerns is, especially these days, and I don't know, I mean, I always hesitate to talk publicly about what I think is happening within African-American families or the public. I'm an old white guy. What do I really know about what it's like being a person of color? I mean, I have a blended family, and so we have lots of interesting discussions around that, but I don't really know. But this is what I think, based on conversations I've had with friends who are African-American, that for many African-American parents, they're not going to encourage their kids to be cops because they don't see that as an honorable profession. They don't want their kids to be cops because of what they believe the police are capable of doing. And that, and I how can you argue with that when you just go to YouTube and type in police brutality, and how do you argue with that when you see it, right? Or you watch a version of the TV program that's now been taken off the air, Cops, right? Most of the people that the police interact with are people of color, and it's just like this perpetuates this vision that the police are trying to oppress poor people or people of color. And in that 18,000 number of police departments, some of them are doing that, and some of them are bad. They ought to revoke the license to be a police department to a significant number of police departments in this country, in my opinion. But we don't have any mechanism for doing that. That doesn't exist. So I think that somebody's, back to your original point, somebody's previous conviction, without understanding the context of that conviction, can in fact be problematic for the diversity of a department. We had a very strong drug court component to our police department strategy. And at one point it dawned on me that we're helping all these people achieve sobriety. And part of doing that is frequently helping them get a job, and that we needed to step up to the plate. So we hired, had lots of people from the drug court working within the police department as volunteers, and we hired some of them as employees, which took some discussion internally about getting over this conviction issue around drugs, right? But my belief is that drug addiction is a public health issue. It's not a crime issue. We've made it criminal, but that's insane. I mean, it just shouldn't be. It's a public health issue. Right.
So let's talk a little bit about the whole defund thing. And we many people have seen it through the window. I saw it reported where they talked about Camden, New Jersey, which is a place that made a decision about its police department. And one of the things that's interesting that interested me was understanding from you that Camden was about the size of a, bigger than a town, 70, 80,000, similar to the size of some of the cities that a few of us know well. including you and I. But the things that they were able to do from a resource standpoint, kind of enabled them to, or empowered them, maybe the terminology, to try something different. So, talk about that a little bit, because I think that your insight is so interesting, from having known the chief and having known the people and understanding, numbers and policing, and, this is how many people you'll normally have in a department for a city this size, and how much or how little Camden may be a model for what may be happening out there, because everybody's certainly talking about it.
Yeah, as they should, because it was one of the most interesting experiments in policing. They didn't intend it to be an experiment. It's just they had such a huge problem with the police workforce in Camden, that the only way for them to genetically engineer the organization's DNA, if you will, was to disband it. So they didn't defund it; they disbanded it,
Right.
Completely got rid of it.
Right.
And then hired back about half of the officers that they thought would embrace this new model of community engagement and preventative orientation to crime. And then they essentially just let the other half go. So there are universal principles, I think, that we should tease out of the Camden experiment, but we have to also understand that it is not going to be possible for most communities to replicate what Camden did, for several reasons.
Yeah.
So Camden is right next to Philadelphia. It had a crime problem that was off the charts, and it had a workforce in the police department that was completely corrupt on a variety of levels, and was indifferent to the crime problems, and was abusive and indifferent to the people they were serving. It's a city of about slightly less than 10 square miles and has about 80,000 people. And it had over 400 police officers in the department.
Wow.
Now, it had a serious crime problem, but to give you some kind of comparison, my hometown of Redlands is about 80,000 people, 40 square miles, doesn't have the same level of crime, but during the recession, we got down to 70 officers, and today there are right around 82 officers. So for the same population city,
right,
you got 82 versus, I think today Camden has like 420, which allows them to do things like foot patrols. It's a much more concentrated city and they give the police officers time to talk to people. They're not going call to call.
right.
They're able to sit and talk to people on their front porch. They have they do these things called pop-up barbecues, where they will just show up in a neighborhood and literally pull out a barbecue. And these are on-duty cops who are able to engage with people. They get to know people. They've created an intimacy between the community and the department that never existed before, and in part because of the sheer numbers. When they disbanded the police department, it went from being the Camden City Police Department to the Camden County Police Department, where the only city they patrolled in the county, at least at the time, was Camden. And the state, they did this in large part with the assistance of the state attorney general, but the state pumped a lot of money into the city too. So there were things that happened there to facilitate this change that can't really happen anyplace else, especially not today when cities are reeling from the fiscal impact of the pandemic.
Sure.
But the principles are important, which is you have to have the right people in the department. You have to have the right leadership. Right. So the guy who was the chief at the time they did this, and then remained the chief up until just a year or so ago, is a guy named Scott Thompson. And he's one of the most courageous police leaders I've personally ever met, because the first few months when they started talking about this up to the disbanding period was a brutal time within the police department. I mean, these cops were super unhappy. They knew a lot of them weren't getting their jobs back, and they weren't nice people to begin with. I mean, so many of them were just not, nobody should have given them a badge and a gun. Right. So that's kind of how they got there. And they've continued, the state has continued to put money into the department, and the city has So they have a lot of technology that other places can't afford, and they've done a lot of things that just aren't possible. But again, the principles here are what are so important. Get rid of the people that are bad cops. You got to do that. Hire the right people.
Right.
Get out of your cars. Find a way to engage the community and think about the harm you may be doing in the community with these people, and embrace them and bring them into the department, and make your model in the city one about co-producing public safety. You're co-producing it with the community. You're not unilaterally telling them this is how we're going to make it safe, whether you like it or not. They co-produce that, and in there are the lessons I think that people should take away from that. They shouldn't dismiss what happened in Camden because they can't afford it, and they shouldn't embrace it blindly, thinking that we'll just do the same thing. It looks to me like Minneapolis is going to do something very similar to this.
That's where I wanted to go, is to really compare that, particularly as I know you have some thoughts about the challenges of policing in a larger city, you know, and what makes it tough.
I do. I think there are, you know, I think the challenge for all of us when we talk about policing is talking about it as if it is exactly the same. Like there's just one way of policing, and that is just not true. It's like what happens in courtrooms in California from county to county, right?
Right.
It is different, you know, even
Yeah.
though there's one California penal code or civil code, and all of the attorneys and judges should be playing by exactly the same set of rules. It's different.
Yes, it is.
You know, it's how they implement that. And that is exactly what happens in policing. So it's complicated and difficult to talk about policing in a too granulated way until you start talking about a particular region, state, or a city. But I think Minneapolis is a place that they have found themselves in a place they cannot easily get out of without a very, very radical approach. And the easiest way, probably for them at this point, is to find a way to disband the department and bring it back with a new vision. And some of those existing police officers are not going to survive that transition. They're just not going to be there. And that may be exact. I don't know enough about the culture of Minneapolis, but I have to tell you that kind of an odd reality that in the world of policing, and you know, there are communities of police chiefs, and by region or nationally, and there's a group of chiefs that belong to this thing called the Major City Chiefs Association in the United States. And Minneapolis was not one of those places that everybody would be, you know, kind of quietly say, boy, that place is about to explode and it's going off the rails. They have clearly had problems over the last several years, but it just wasn't known as one of the really, really bad places. Now, it may be that just was the perception that was wrong, and, you know, even the other chiefs didn't really truly understand what was happening there, but it doesn't matter. You know, at the end of the day, where they are today is what matters. And I think the only way they're going to get out of this, and they're going to, I think if they do this, reinventing the police department, they're going to do everybody in America a favor, because other police departments are going to watch this experiment closely, and other mayors, city councils, police chiefs, sheriffs, whoever, are going to say this worked or it didn't work. And by that I mean that this transition away from having the police as first responders to mental illness, homelessness, and drug addiction, which create so many of the conflicts, and then the other pieces that go into this, whether they preclude the police from making custodial arrests of people for low-grade crimes or whatever they end up with, they're going to have to implement, I think, many of the suggestions the protesters have put forward, many of which, quite frankly, I think a lot of police officers, a lot of chiefs completely agree with. And in fact, many of those things have already been accomplished and have been underway or have already been accomplished in many police departments all over the country.
Right. So let's talk about a couple things that you see that are going well in policing. We were talking a little bit yesterday about 8 Can't Wait, some of those types of principles. And then the other piece is, you know, if you had your wish list in terms of what needs to happen legislatively, I know that you're an authority on this, and you know, not to preview too much. I know that they're trying to get an op-ed out of you to talk about those things, but you know, what are some of the things that we need to be doing, and some of the things, you know, you said that policing is very different. You know, something like 8 Can't Wait. These particular principles, you know, we were a lot further from those, you know, years ago. You know, but where do we need to go? And you know, on the positive side, what kind of steps have we made that are good?
So, again, when we talk about policing, it is difficult to talk about it always. Just one thing is it's so different. And the way I like to segment policing is by urban, suburban, and rural policing.
Mm-hmm.
And urban policing, I think, is so much more complicated for people to understand or to do well, because urban living, I think, is more complicated. I lived in Washington, D.C. for many years, and it is just a different way of life, you know.
Right.
And it in suburban or rural communities, you just know more people. You're much more attuned to how things are happening. I think the speed of life is slower, and policing really is just a reflection of society. So in some places, I think it does work well. I think that if you were to survey Americans, if somehow you could get a good survey of everybody across the United States, you would see there are regional differences in how people think about the police and what works and what doesn't work well in policing, and the level of support. My personal belief is that Americans want all Americans want a safe community.
Oh, yeah.
Not all Americans think that the police are the principal provider of that safety, but in most communities, especially suburban and rural ones, I think there's a high level of support for the police, and in large part, that's probably because the police behave differently. You generally, so Redlands, for instance, has had 5 or 6 marches during this period of time, and they've really, if you watch the way the police behave and how people in those marches act, they're more like parades with a social conscience. There's no antagonism between the police and the people marching. There's no skirmish lines. The cops are not wearing tactical gear. They're not wearing helmets. They don't have their batons out.
Right.
They're just trying to keep people safe from getting run over by cars. Right. And I think that's being replicated. It has been replicated all across the United States in urban environments. That is not always what we see. Sometimes the protests have been super peaceful, and then things change, and there's been looting, obviously, or the police start throwing tear gas, and you know the whole thing goes crazy. So I do think that, as I said earlier, that policing today is qualitatively so much better, both in terms of its ability to analyze crime patterns. To the training is so different than it was when I went through. I went through an academy that was 3 months long. Today, the police academy is 6 months long, followed by 6 months of field training. So you're in training for a year in California before they let you loose on the street by yourself. That is so different than what it used to be. Is that enough? I don't think so. I think we need the idea of a police college. A lot of countries do this, that you go. Your college experience is really framed around, at least for a few years, framed around being a police officer. And you spend a lot more time understanding psychology and sociology and cultural anthropology, diversity, all these things that should be tools in your toolbox as a cop that you don't get. Right. You know, some places have raised the educational level of policing. In my own department, when I was there, you had to have a bachelor's degree for us to hire you as a police officer, or be able to achieve a bachelor's degree before you got off probation. And that's because my belief is that having a piece of paper called a bachelor's degree does not make you a better cop. But if you have good people skills, you have high emotional intelligence, you're a mature person, and you have good policing skills, having a college degree makes you even that much better because it's given you the discipline you need and the exposure to different people, different concepts and things that you wouldn't get in the police academy.
Sure.
But in many parts of this country, the educational requirement to become a police officer is a GED. I find that just a little bit problematic given the fact that police officers are the only class of public employee in the United States that without prior judicial review can restrict your freedom and use force against you up to and including taking your life.
Right.
I just think we need the best critical thinkers we can get our hands on if you're going to give them a gun and that kind of authority.
Sure.
I think the police are doing a good job technically on crime control. And I think in some communities, they're doing an excellent job in community outreach. And in some places, they're doing a great job in terms of changing their workforce, in terms of diversity. If you think about, so we're in Southern California, if you think about LAPD, the largest police department in California, and what it looked like in the like 92 during the Rodney King riots, and what it looks like today, it is almost an entirely different department. The majority of officers at LAPD are people of color.
Mm-hmm.
In 92, the overwhelming majority were white males.
Yeah.
So, and I think white males represent like 30% of the workforce now at LAPD. So the workforce population, from a diversity standpoint, mirrors exactly or very close the diversity population of the city of Los Angeles. So I think they're doing that right. Now, do they do other things right? That's, there were challenging moments, to say the least,
Sure,
during these protests in
right.
LA. So I think, those are the kind of things that are doing. I think there's a lot of problems. The police still don't get the symbolism of the military-like equipment, or how they appear when they're wearing military garb. And sometimes it is even hard for me to tell, am I looking at a military unit or is that a police unit, right?
Right, sure.
And I understand that. I was on a SWAT team earlier in my career. But I think that is problematic when what you are trying to do is enhance the trust and confidence of the police. If you are engaged in an active shooter situation with terrorists, nobody's going to begrudge you the use of an armored vehicle, automatic weapons, and a lot of tactical gear. When you are dealing with Americans who are outraged at police behavior, and I'm thinking of Ferguson now when I say this,
right.
And you roll out the military equipment and have snipers pointing guns at people, and the cops have machine guns, and their children and families, ministers who are not assaulting the police, something is drastically wrong with that equation.
Sure,
and
sure.
So I don't know if I've answered your question, Jim.
You absolutely have. You absolutely have.
We were talking about the 8 Can't Wait.
Yeah. You were mentioning, we had talked a little bit about 8 Can't Wait, and basically those are, as I understand it, 8 principles that include, chokeholds that have a whole lot of discussion, that, people have listed as these standards. These 8 things are things all police departments should do. And I think that based on kind of what's been going on over the years, a lot of departments have hit that, or most of it have hit all of those marks, have they not?
Well, I think, again, this depends on where you are in the country. And but I think people might be surprised at how many departments are doing this. But having said that, this is where the lack of a national coherence is problematic, because these 8 things, with the exception of one that I'll mention in a second, should be standard in every police department across the United States. This should be how American policing is done. And I just don't, and that's just not the case. I mean, there are some really small departments, even some big ones, that still do things that I shake my head. I can't believe they're doing for your listeners' benefit, in case they're not familiar with this, let me just list the things. The 8 principles that 8 Can't Wait talk about are: ban chokeholds and strangleholds, require de-escalation, require warning before shooting, require require that the officers exhaust all alternatives before shooting. That officers have a duty to intervene when they see officers doing inappropriate things.
Yeah,
A ban on shooting at moving vehicles. Require that they implement a use of force continuum and require comprehensive reporting. So depending on what state you're in, there's a higher percentage of agencies that do most of these things. The only one I probably disagree with a little bit is the use of force continuum, only because that's outdated. That was the model in policing up until, I don't know, 5 or 8 years ago.
right.
And it's been replaced with a much more scientifically and evidence-based approach. So, but I get the sentiment here that what they're saying is you should have a strategy, training, plan, policy that does not allow the officers to immediately go to the most extreme level of use of force, unless they have to do that to save their life, right? But all of these other things, I don't know any police chief really that disagrees with this. There are few people probably that have problems with the not shooting at moving vehicles. But I have to tell you, having investigated some of these in my own department or seen them when I was a young cop in the early 80s, it is so dangerous and to shoot at a moving vehicle because it's hard to hit it, first of all. So that bullet is going to go someplace. It may not go into that car, so you may hit an innocent bystander, innocent motorist. It is just literally physically difficult to shoot at a vehicle that's traveling at a high rate of speed. The many police shootings are the result of the motorists who get shot backing their car up quickly as a result of a traffic stop, and the cops believing that they're going to get hit by the car, so they shoot. But then there's also cases where they're talking to somebody at the car, then all of a sudden they take off and a pursuit is going to ensue, but instead of the pursuit starting without shooting, the cop starts shooting at them. And there have been instances, there was a really tragic case, I can't remember exactly where it was, I think down south, where some teenagers jumped in their car. They were at a party and the cop showed up, the kids jumped in the car and took off, and one cop just starts shooting at this car full of teenagers who were just leaving because they know that they're probably going to get in trouble with their parents because they're at a party where there's alcohol. I mean, what the heck is that guy thinking, right? So I think that most of these ideas and these principles you could find in almost all departments that we believe are healthy, pro-social, and well-functioning police departments, because none of these concepts are things that have not been discussed in policing for a very long time through all the membership groups and in national forums. And so I even asked the local leadership of our police department if they're doing all this, and the answer is yes. They, in one form or another, they're doing all of these things, and these principles exist within that department. So, and I think that's pretty common today.
Fantastic. Well, Chief, I really appreciate you coming on and giving us the playing field on policing and some thought about where we're going, where we ought to go. It's been incredibly useful, and I'm sure that the listeners will get a great deal, hopefully some perspective, some thought of nuance, how to maybe apply some of the things, some of the facts and some of the background that actually should frame our discussion, because this moment is so important. Even though emotion has brought it on, we have to be extremely thoughtful and maybe a little less emotional about what we implement and execute. And I think that the information that you provided, to get the wealth of 30 to 40 years of experience in an hour, should hopefully give a whole lot of us a bit of a leg up in terms of understanding how to frame the issue. So
it's my pleasure, Joe.
Fantastic. Well, thanks, Chief. I much appreciate it. We got it, guys? Perfect. I told you that Jim Bueermann was the man, right? He gave us some great information. So here's my a little quick flow just to button it all up. First of all, I don't know if I belong in the place to button up, 40 years of policing and all the requisite experience, but I think that what we do want to take out of it is that whether you are looking at Can't Wait, whether you are looking at defunding the police, however you are feeling about what it is that's going on right now, I don't think there's any question that we have an opportunity to really change some things. I loved I think one of the most important things Jim had to say was the idea that the best point at which you can decide what's happening with a police officer, or the best checkpoint, for lack of a better term, is when you hire them. And so if we get it right to begin with, we've got a better chance to be on the right train as we go along. There'll be problems, there'll be ups and downs. Police wellness is going to be a huge issue. And I do believe that it can't be just about defunding the police or changing what they do or being punitive because of real things that are happening with bad cops. It also has to be about making sure we're doing everything we can for police wellness. If police are really going to serve us, we have to, their wellness has to be important. So just like with anything else, there has to be nuance, there has to be balance. I'm thrilled that there are people like Jim Bueermann that help chart the way forward. He's going to continue to be a national authority. You're going to continue to hear and see him around, and people like him who have a view of police work that is honest, that's based on experience, that's also based on science and research and evidence in terms of where we need to go. So let's continue to proceed with that balance. And even while we have these necessary discussions and talk about the major reform that absolutely needs to be made, let's have the perspective, embrace research, embrace facts and science that help us get where we need to go so that police can be everything that they're supposed to be. And that's Joe Speak for this time. Joe Richardson. See you guys pretty soon. You take your time leaving, but hurry back. All right, peace.